over the course of my talk, I'll take you back to more classical neuroscience topic, and this is programmable plasticity, and in particular, how to integrate this into experiment descriptions for neuromorphic hardware, and in our case, for analog neuromorphic hardware or mixed signal neuromorphic hardware. Doesn't really matter in this case. And what I want to do across this talk is to first take apart what do we mean by programmable plasticity, what does it mean for this to be available on neuromorphic hardware, where are the constraints, what do we need to take into account, and then how we integrated it into the experiment description. And in the end, what can we actually do with it? Give a kind of outlook. What can be done with this? Okay, so what do we mean with programmable plasticity? There's two parts to it. The one part is the plasticity part, and the other one is that it's actually programmable. And what we mean by plasticity is that when you look at the left-hand side, you see a very simple network with two populations and one projection. And plasticity in this case means that we can either alter the topology of the network or the parameterization of the network elements during experiment runtime. And the important part here is that we alter them according to decisions which are made with observations during the experiment. So we don't, prior to the experiment, know what we need to change, because if we would know this, we could program it beforehand and there would be no real-time decisions to be made, and it's not really plasticity anymore then. And the second part is the programmable part, which we want to be as freely possible as can be done. And in conjunction with neuromorphic hardware, this also means that there might be constraints coming from the hardware side that we need to take into account. And what we mean by programmable is that when we have a plasticity rule, which is, for example, this function f, which takes the weight and the rate of the postsynaptic neuron, we want once to have this function to be somewhat configurable, and in addition to be able to look at different observables. So in this case, the weight and the postsynaptic rate, but maybe also some correlation or other observables. And also we want this to be executable configurably, so meaning that we can select when we want to have this plasticity to be run and with what period when you want to have it run periodically or similar. And so when we use mixed signal analog neuromorphic hardware, there's multiple steps involved which gets us from our abstract experiment description down to the hardware part. And when we want to use the neuromorphic hardware, ideally, we want to describe the topology of the neural network consisting of populations of neurons and projections of synapses, and also to somehow write down the experiment protocol, meaning we add the input, we say when should what change, if we know that beforehand. Yes. And what we want to do with the programmable plasticity is that we want to include this as a first-class citizen, so to speak, into this experiment description, opposed to having it like attached to a network entity in form of, for example, short-term plasticity compared to no plastic synapses or something like this. And what this means for neuromorphic hardware integration is that we somehow need to get down to the hardware part, and this involves several steps. And for one, we need to place the network entities on the hardware entities. So in this example down here, we need to place the synapses and the neurons, and we need to decide how to route the signals from the neurons to the synapses again. In the analog neuromorphic hardware case, we also need to calibrate, for example, the neuron circuits to exhibit a certain dynamical behavior. And in addition, for the user to actually be able to only talk to this nice abstract representation, we need to include data transformations which transform our user-given data down to the hardware and our hardware-given data back up to the user. And so in order to include the programmable plasticity into this framework, we need to do all these steps also for the plasticity. And I'm going to explain in the upcoming slides how we did this, what we needed to do in order to make this happen. And so what we are targeting with this approach, Brainscales 2, which is the newest version of the Brainscales neuromorphic hardware developed in Heidelberg. It's the right rack behind me, and it contains analog adaptive exponential leaky integrated fire neurons with conductance-based or current-based synapses. And in contrast to the BrainScale 1 system, it has a speed of approximately 1,000 instead of 10,000. And on the right-hand side, you can see the chip at the top and the lab setup, or one lab setup behind it. And one such chip contains 512 neurons with 156 synapses each. And in addition contains, and this is why we want to look at this with plasticity, it contains 2 embedded single instruction multiple data processors, which we can use to formulate plasticity rules, which are somewhat arbitrary. And to talk to this, we use layers of software which abstract away more and more from the hardware intricacies and target multiple front ends, for example, Pine, which I will talk about in this talk, but also a Tux-based implementation and a PyTorch-based implementation for machine learning applications. And one part which will become important later is that for the real-time runtime control of the system, we currently use FPGAs with some form of state machine which plays back your experiment through physical time. Yes. So when we want to formulate plasticity rules, one thing we need to look at is what can we actually control, or what can we look at from the processor which will implement the plasticity in the end. And there are multiple parts which can be done, especially for BrainScale 2, but might also be applicable to other similar hardware systems. So there's controllables, meaning that you can change parameters of the network or change network topology. For example, synaptic weights or neuron parameterization or routing parameterization or other stuff. This is why there are dots. And also, on the other hand, there are observables, which means that you can look at real-time or data which is generated during the experiment. And there's 2 main things which we can look at on BrainScale 2. This is parallel ADC recording, parallel meaning parallel for all neurons. And with this, we can look at synaptic pre-post spike pair correlation, causal and acausal, with exponential decay, and membrane adaptation and synaptic input recordings of the neurons. And in addition, we have a firing rate kind of mechanism which is available by counting spikes for each neuron. So with these observables, we can now look at how we can integrate plasticity. And there's also, because neuromorphic hardware is not perfect, there's also inherent restrictions or limitations to this. And these will later then change what we can actually implement interface-wise and also use case-wise. And one important thing to note for the analog neuromorphic hardware, or for any time-continuous neuromorphic hardware, is that the learning rules which are implemented on this classical processors, they somehow have to be run concurrently to the network emulation, because in contrast to some simulation, we can't just pause the network emulation, but the network emulation continues to run. So our learning rule evolves concurrently to the network emulation, and this limits, on the other hand, our ability to perform crazily complex computations, because they take time. And 3 things maybe to note which affect how much time we take to compute things is, for one, physical locality. So on the right-hand side, you see going from green to red and from small to large arrows on the neuromorphic chip, which means that the most costly operation will be to transfer data between chips, and the least costly operation, at least for the SIMD unit, will be to transfer or to look at information which span multiple rows in the synapses. And the other thing is that obviously for the embedded system, there's only so much available memory. So you can't have large or super large programs for the instruction memory side, or store additional amounts of state variables which you want to access again in the plasticity rule. And the last thing which affects the time we need to compute the plasticity is calculation accuracy. So on the brain scales 2 SIMD units, there's no hardware float implementation. Also on the scalar unit, which means that somehow we need to change our arithmetics to an integer or fixed point kind of style. And what we can look now at is how to integrate the plasticity abstraction into this evolution of the neural network time domain. And on brain scales 2, what you do is we, on the host computer, describe our experiment. And this is then compiled down to a so-called playback program, which is played back on the accompanying FPGA, which defines the temporal evolution of the experiment. And concurrently to this, the neural network core on the brain scales 2 chip evolves and has some dynamics and spike output maybe or something else. And what we added here is that the embedded processors first get a program which is to be executed and then are synchronized in time with the neural network dynamics. And in this time synchronized so-called real-time section of the experiment, then multiple, or at least potentially multiple plasticity rules can be scheduled and run sequentially or alternatingly and get observables from the neural network core, update some parameters, store recorded observables, which after the experiment can be read out and looked at by the user. And in order to make this as seamless as possible from the user side. And the scheduling we do is using an earliest deadline first scheduler. This part is not super important, but what this yields is that each rule which is here, these boxes, has a fixed latency from the defined, I want to have this rule run at time point X, to it actually being executed, which is nice because you don't lose this synchronicity to the neural network emulation. Also, it has a low computational overhead, so your latency between wished for and actual execution will not be super far away from each other. And what is also nice, but what we didn't yet explore, is that instead of like predefining, I want to have my plasticity rule run every 1 second bio time or something like this, we could also imagine during the experiment to, depending on what we observe in one plasticity rule, change the dynamic execution schedule of a rule. So for example, if we observe, okay, now something important is happening, we might want to change our execution schedule of some plasticity rule, which would be possible with this approach. And how does this look like for user, which is maybe the more important part than how is it actually implemented. So what we did is we integrated this into Pine. And in Pine, you describe your network by defining populations of neurons and projections of synapses. And the projections take populations as their pre-post pairs. And we extended this to describing plasticity rules, not as an extension to, for example, a synapse, but as a first-class citizen separate part, which you can define, and you can define what the code which shall be executed as part of this rule shall be for the embedded processors. Also, you can specify the timing of the execution and what you want to record and look at later. And then afterwards, just add this to each network element you want to have this plasticity rule act on. So basically, this also allows you to have non-local rules, because otherwise, when you would have a different synapse type, for example, you only have local rules. And this maximizes our flexibility in describing yet undescribed plasticity rules. And after you run your experiment, which is this experiment protocol thingy here, you can get your data back from your customizably definable observables of the rule in a similar fashion as you would get back spike trains in Pine or the membrane recording. And 2 or 3 parts here I want to look in detail. So how do we actually specify our embedded processor code? and how do we specify what we want to record here. And the embedded processor code we specify by specifying a functional interface, which is then called at the specified times during the experiment runtime. And it gets all network entities you want your rule to act on. And you can, in your function body, then look at observables of these elements or change parameters of these elements. And in the background, we generate code for the scheduling of this functional rule and also for the translation of the hardware placement description of the network entities so that you, inside your actually executed function, have all the information available you want to have, which in the abstract description of your experiment you wouldn't have. And in addition, if you then want to record something, you just get a recording memory data structure and therefore have access to the recording you previously specified by saying, okay, I want to have an observable, which is called my observable, and it shall be available for each synapse. And this in the background generates like a recording structure, which is placed in memory for the embedded processor. And you can access it here, and later it's automatically translated to this getter thing in the Pine interface. And the question now is, what can we do with it? And I want to highlight two things. The one is more of a tech demo style experiment, which is a simple homeostatic rule. And then in addition, real world, so to speak, investigation. And the simple homeostatic rule, you can also, I will point out this in the end again, look at in the tutorial session on Friday, probably. At least currently we are planning to do this. And I mean, at least currently we think it works. This very simple rule looks at plastic synapses between one Poisson source and a couple of target neurons. And the goal is to have these target neurons firing with a constant rate. And and the rule that we use is very simple. It just takes the sign of the difference between the target firing rate and the actual firing rate. And so this means each time the actual firing rate is too small, we increase the rate by one value, and otherwise we decrease it. So in the middle, you also see this in the weight evolution, that they flicker around with plus minus one and eventually converge to some value. And on the top, you see that all neurons, which are actually in this case all 512 neurons on one chip, convert to the proposed target firing rate. And it's not super nicely converging, probably because the Poisson source rate is not high enough, which is also why the weights are still fluctuating after convergence. And there's two things which we can note in addition about the actual implementation, and this is the one here on the top, where we see that the duration of the rule execution decreases with the number of target neurons, which highlights one advantage of the SIMD unit processors, which is that they scale perfectly until you reach the column-wise or the neuron-wise maximum parallelism on the chip. And you also see this drop here in the end, which is when we actually use the two processors and not just one, because we actually use the two halves of the chip and not just one. And also you see here in the top and in the bottom, the latency between the wished for execution of the rule and the actual execution of the rule, which is almost always these 10 microseconds and sometimes 30. And this sometimes 30 is the first execution of the rule, which is due to the fact that there the instruction caches are still cold. And it just takes longer to fetch the code for the rule to be actually run. And this year and last year, there were also already two investigations in which use the proposed plasticity description framework and looked at actual and not just for example plasticity rules. And the one is where Robin Dietrich is also here somewhere, looked at sequence learning with analog multi-compartment neurons and structural STDP. And the other one is by Amani Atui, who also already spoke here about her poster of multi-timescale synaptic plasticity on analog neuromorphic hardware. And I want to tease this again shortly because I think it's super nice. So there we look, or they look at multi-timescale, meaning early phase and late phase weight and combinations of these on a synapse. And the difficult thing here is that the rule is not so simple anymore. So you have, in this case, 3 coupled differential equations for different parts. So early phase weight, late phase weight, and protein amount here. And what I think is nice about this implementation is that some parts of the observables are solved by using not just the synapse local observables, but adaptation traces to emulate actually in an analog fashion the calcium concentration on the synapse. And as she already showed you, again, the results match from simulation and emulation. And in addition, we had to, which I mentioned, also reduce the precision of the differential equations, which was successfully done in order to be able to fit this on the embedded processors. So to sum up, what did I show you? So I showed you how can we, from an abstract network description point of view, specify plasticity, which is then actually executed on a mixed signal neuromorphic hardware, and what steps we needed to do to make this happen. So for one, we needed to somehow get the time synchronicity between the plasticity execution and the physical emulation of the network figured out, and be able to schedule the rules, compile the code automatically, provide the mapping result data to the plasticity rule, because otherwise we can't really access the correct synapses or neurons or similar stuff. And that we can actually use this in experiments. So for one, the homeostatic toy example rule, and in the other case, the multi-timescale synaptic plasticity poster, which is in the first floor south side. And where do we want to go from here? So there are 3 things and maybe a 4th. During looking at this plasticity abstraction, we found that there might be some beneficial hardware optimizations for the embedded processor. So the AMD unit currently does not have hardware float support, as I already mentioned, which greatly limits, or I mean, it doesn't really limit, but it's much more difficult to transform a known rule to this kind of numerical format. This is not only true for the SMD processor, but the scalar unit, at least you can simulate the float operations. Then, in addition, the rules are currently written down in C++, which is the language for the embedded processor, and you somehow get an abstraction from the low-level processor intrinsic features, but not super nice. And our goal would be to introduce some kind of domain-specific language for the plasticity algorithm description, which would remove the need to know the intrinsics of the processor. And in addition, as last point, this is all not gradient-based learning, but online plasticity with a static kind of meta or hyperparameter space. And what we want to do is to combine the online plasticity part with gradient-based learning, either using meta-learning on the learning rule hyperparameters, or using the online plasticity to, like, as a supplicant to the gradient-based learning. For example, to integrate local regularization automatically without having to do this in the outer loop, which might improve the ability to train seamlessly on the neuromorphic hardware. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention. And you can either look the demo up yourself or join us on Friday for the tutorial session. Thank you.